Adult Sunday School leaders, I hope you had a great class yesterday. I know I've gotten some comments on the YouTube comments page, and so if something's working in your class that you'd want to share, please comment and tell me what's going on. I'd love to see that, and then other people who watch this can see that as well and see something maybe they can use in their class. Well, as you know, we're continuing in our unit entitled Thrive, Living in Real Joy. This week we're in session 2, Sharing with Joy. We're looking at Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 21. And the point of the lesson is, I can share Christ with joy no matter what. So this week as we're looking at sharing, we're not looking at sharing stuff. We're not looking at sharing the things that we own. Actually, we're looking at sharing Christ. And we start, look in verse 12 there, and Paul talks about his current condition that he's in. And what is that? If you remember, he's imprisoned. And so he's basically saying, don't worry about what's happening to me. And why is that? Well, he tells us why. Because it's, first of all, it's advancing the gospel. And that advancing word is, it's a word that was used in Greek to denote the progress of an army, and specifically the cutting away of the undergrowth and removal of barriers to allow the advancement of an army. I'll give you an example. As 2 summers when I was in college, I worked in the Kansas and Oklahoma area on pipeline construction, believe it or not. And in fact, that's probably what encouraged me to take an inside job. But anyway, so I worked 2 summers in pipeline construction, and there were basically 3 crews with natural gas pipeline construction. You had the front crew, who went well in advance of the other crews, and they would make the gates, because your pipeline would have to go through farms, they would go through fences, and so you'd have to cut out a portion of the fence and make a gate. You would have to clear the trees, remove any trees, remove any brush that's in the right of way of the pipeline, stake out the path of the pipeline so the ditching machine could come in and know where to cut that ditch. Then you had the construction crew. That was the ones that digged the ditch, laid the pipe. And then you had the cleanup crew that would come in behind, and they would backfill the dirt, smooth it out, repair any of the gates, repair those, make those back to regular fences, and then reseed the area that the pipeline went through. So Paul basically said, I'm on the front crew. I'm laying the groundwork for the army of Christ. And then he talks about being in chains. Well, this isn't the chains that we think of. We think of these big heavy chains, people in dungeons, and that kind of image. Well, that's not what he was talking about here. The chains, that would have been a very short length of chain bound to the wrists of prisoners and guards, similar to handcuffs. So he was in close relationship to those guards who were basically chained to him. And so the guards, of course, had a rotation and shifts. And while Paul was in Rome there, while he was being imprisoned, the whole palace guard knew about Paul and knew his testimony, because Paul was literally just an arm's length away from these guards and basically had an open ear to tell them about Christ. So Paul here, he's given his testimony, and it's an encouragement to those Philippian Christians who will face trials in the future, to look at those trials, to look at the things that come into life with a long-term perspective. And this gets back to our definition last week of joy. It's that long-term perspective of things. It's not short-term, looking at the immediate here and now, but it's looking at what this can mean in the long haul. Well, if we look at a little background about how Paul got here, just real briefly, if you want to look through this and just get it in your mind, how Paul actually ended up in prison, you can go back to Acts 21, looking in verse 27 through chapter 22, verse 2. Paul causes a ruckus, as he always does, and so the Jewish elite arrest him. He appears before the Sanhedrin, and in chapter 23, verse 12, there's a conspiracy to kill Paul. Then we get to Acts 24, and Paul is before Felix, the governor. We get to chapter 25. Paul is before Festus, the new governor. We get over to chapter 26. Paul is before King Agrippa, Get over to chapter 27. Paul goes to Rome. And in Acts 28, Paul is in Rome. He's awaiting trial before Caesar. And here is where he wrote what we call the prison epistles, with Philippians being one of them. So all these things that happened to Paul, he's saying, don't worry about these things. These have happened so the gospel can be advanced. We get down to verses 15 through 18, and Paul's talking about, while he's being imprisoned, there are other people, other factions that are rising up that are preaching Christ, and some are preaching with good intentions, and some are preaching with not so good intentions. In fact, I think he uses the term preaching out of envy. You know, in a leadership vacuum, someone will rise, or someone will try to rise to take power, and some of those had some impure motives. It could be that some were saying, well, Paul's in prison, and I'm preaching now. I'm the new leader. And it could be that some was saying Paul was a failure because he was in prison. He was stirring up trouble. Some actually had some good motives, some pure motives. We see that in verse 16. That was done out of love and out of goodwill to spread the news of Christ. And he says, regardless of the motive, Christ is still being preached. Now, this does not mean Paul is not justifying the philosophy of that the ends justify the means, that it doesn't matter what tactics we use, God's going to use them and bless them. It doesn't mean that at all. It doesn't mean that Paul is putting his blessing on false teaching. And if we look over in Galatians chapter 1, verses 6 through 9, he says, you know, if anybody else is bringing a gospel other than this, let him be accursed. It's not that. It's not that the doctrine was bad. The doctrine was probably okay. It was just the motives in which those people were preaching. And you probably have seen that in churches as well, the motives of people to get a Sunday school class or to get a leadership position. So really probably no different today than it was back then. So we think about today, a couple of examples come to mind. One I'm going to share with you, and that's like the health and wealth gospel. A lot of it, that's in the benefit of the minister and the ministry. You know, keep giving, keep giving, keep giving, and the person accumulates more jet planes and mansions and all this. In all that, even though that's a selfish motive, in my opinion, there are nuggets of truth. There is gospel that is being presented in that. So we get down to verse 20, and we see Paul is stating his hope for being delivered in two ways. First, he states it negatively, that he would not be ashamed. Now, this is not how we would think of it. It's not that feeling of guilt. It's not our English word that we would use there. It's more a better term would be put to shame. He would not be put to shame. And then positively, he says that Christ would be exalted in his body. Not that I would exalt Christ, but that the boldness was on Paul's part, that the Holy Spirit working in Paul would bring glory to Christ. Whether his situation led to his release or to his death, Paul was going to remain faithful to Christ, and that Christ would be glorified in all this. We get down to verse 21, a very famous verse, to live as Christ. And we can compare that to Galatians 2:20, another one of Paul's writings, and see a very similar passage there. Paul's purpose in life was to boldly share Christ and to become more like him. And the longer he could live, in spite of the bad circumstances, he would strive to do that. Christ was more than Paul's helper. Christ was Paul's life. And since Christ was Paul's life, the longer Paul could live, the more Paul could do on this earth for Christ. But if he died, whether that was natural causes or he was put to death, he was executed, he thought that would be even better because he could immediately be with Christ face to face. It would be his gain, he says. So that's why Paul did not fear death. He says, here's something to think about. And I know we say these things, and I don't think we really think about what we're saying. Oftentimes in class, I'll start off by saying, what's something good that's happened to you this week? And somebody occasionally will say something like, well, we all woke up this morning, and that's better than the alternative. We know what we're saying. But you know, if we really think about it, if we're a Christian, if we're a believer in Christ, and we didn't wake up this morning, if we died, we would be face to face with Christ, and that's actually a better circumstance than what we're in now. So, all this to say, how can we share Christ with joy? because that's the title of our lesson, Sharing with Joy. Well, remember, we need to look at the long-term benefits, not the short-term conveniences. What do I mean by that? I can remember 30 plus years ago being trained in what was called CWT, or Continuing Witness Training. It was the Southern Baptist Convention's kind of spin on EE, or Evangelism Explosion. I can remember getting our assignments and going out and just hoping, praying almost, that the person wouldn't be home, that nobody would answer the door. I was not sharing with joy. I was sharing out of guilt or fear. Actually, I was in fear that I would have to share, because I was focused on those short-term inconveniences of meeting somebody I didn't know, of maybe getting rejected, maybe getting the door slammed in my face, maybe getting some questions that I couldn't answer, instead of looking at the long term, suffering through those short-term inconveniences, looking at the long term of maybe leading somebody to Christ who would lead somebody who might lead somebody, and how that might affect generations and generations. So that's all for this week. Next week we'll be looking at following with joy, picking up in Philippians chapter 2. Don't forget to pray for your class this week.